Year 2003. No internet, no smartphones. When I was away from my PC, I could code only through the phone. How do you code with an analog, wired phone, you ask? Just call your friend, tell him the code, and he would read you the compiler errors and let you know how your code works. By phone. That's how I personally programmed after school, whether my PC was occupied or I was held hostage at my grandmother's place. Hi, I'm Deriv'era, and this video is about Dark Basic, a piece of my personal history, my childhood, and a part of how I became a developer, and probably who I am today. In 2002, dial-up internet was common in the US, but in Eastern Europe, after the collapse of the USSR, the Yugoslav wars, and conflicts like Chechen and Dagestan wars, the region was still recovering, and everyone in my school dreamed to become a bandit, not a scientist or cosmonaut. And I thought about becoming a bandit too, of course. Even with growing trade between and within countries, computers were still considered luxury, partly due to lack of money, partly because of lack of knowledge, and people mostly didn't bother to read and learn about computers, while Western Europe was actively educating IT to children since 90s or even 80s. If you wanted to make a game, you would struggle because information was so hard to find. I learned Quick Basic and Turbo Pascal exclusively by function references provided inside the programs, and by after-school club where we learned how to put Hello World onto the screen. For our teacher, input and output was an ultimate skill. She didn't know anything better, and university wasn't anything different. I was asked not to visit C++ lectures cause I trolled the knowledge of our teacher. She really sucked at sorting algorithms. I didn't spend much time on Pascal and Basic because I've got an access to Macromedia Flash MX CD pretty soon, and found a book to learn it in a better way than reading function references. In 2003, I found an advertisement for Dark Basic in a game magazine. It promised the ability to create 3D games, exactly what I was looking for. Before discovering Dark Basic, I had a strange idea that all games were made with Flash. I hadn't heard of any other tools, and didn't know how to create graphics in Pascal beyond drawing lines on the screen. I genuinely believe Sega Mega Drive games were made with older versions of Flash. Well, I was 13, and despite programming, I had weird childhood misconceptions. Convincing my parents to buy Dark Basic was a pain, but I managed to make it happen, and got my hands on the cardboard box containing this software. It was the version that would later be considered classic. By then, the rest of the Dark world was already moving on to Dark Basic Pro, but where I lived, new technologies took a while to catch up. Dark Basic Classic was still at its peak. Here is a nice image of the CD from the version I probably had, or at least something very similar. So, what is Dark Basic? It's a programming language. It's the software to write code in this language and to run it. Also some additional media to use in your games. The promise was buy it and you would be able to make your own games in easy and understandable way. The physical copy also came with a manual that explains the language basics along with the list of all the commands and what they did. It also came with an additional book that I can't seem to find anywhere. It contained instructions for creating a simple game, an arena shooter where you and a goblin shot at each other in a match, each with its own frag counter. I have no idea if anyone ever scanned this book or if it ever existed digitally, but I remember it well enough to have been inspired by it today. From this good memory, I decided to create an arena game of my own, adding multiple enemies, level ups, upgrades, multiple enemy types, and even a proper weapon model instead of just a rotated cylinder. To truly feel the soul of programming language, I believe you have to code with it. Otherwise, it's just a history lesson. Let's check out the demos to see what you can expect from Dark Basic. Rift Space is a space game heavily inspired by Elite. Rift Space eventually turned into a whole series of games, was sold in stores, making it a budget commercial success. It's also one of the pinnacles of game creation using Dark Basic software. For some reason though, it doesn't support a mouse, so I'll need to use keys to navigate. The goal, as far as I understood, is to take missions and destroy pirates or criminals to earn rewards. For 2002, it doesn't look bad, even if the controls are awkward and the visuals are a bit ugly compared to X Beyond the Frontier from year 2000. It definitely has some collision problems too. Bad collisions are a big part of Dark Basic. Now let's jump into the demos provided as source code to showcase Dark Basic's capabilities. The official programming environment runs at a resolution of 640 by 480 pixels and was already terrible by 2004 standards. It doesn't even support a mouse wheel, and the mouse wheel was invented back in 1996. Or it is just broken, hard to tell. Iced is a demo with multiple enemies designed to show how to handle multiple entities on the level. Dark Basic has no object structures in code and no pointers compared to C, so it's not trivial. So Iced is an unfinished shooting game with fake mirroring effects to simulate ice and a couple of killable enemies. Why does the laser shoot arrows? I have no idea, some kind of creative vision. The entire UI is static except for one arrow, and I have no clue what this arrow even does. Swarm is a variation of the Galaga game. I've never played the original Galaga. I always preferred Famicom Galaxia. Games like this are where Dark Basic shines. The problem back then was that everyone wanted to create a Doom 3 killer. In other words, to create a new shooter that will have everything but better, or GTA but better. Only a few people around the community knew how to make games like this and understood the amount of effort required. A few people knew about the quality of the tools you needed to make something on the peak of 2000s technologies, and the amount of knowledge that was required, and even those few didn't have this knowledge. And these professional tools were expensive and simply not available for anyone. Dark Basic couldn't handle this level, but Dark Basic in comparison was insanely cheap tool. Tank game is one of my favorites. It has terraforming of the ground and overall atmosphere and creative vision. The code for it is fairly simple and short, but it has some visual punch. The good thing about Dark Basic is that it doesn't shine without users' creativity. It's not like modern Unreal Engine where you can flip free assets and blueprints to make something that looks good and has a functional game loop. You need creativity to make something to look at least somewhat appealing. Water simulation, how about that? Waves, obstacles, jumps, and a goblin on a water scooter. You can even use the obstacles to perform high jumps while enjoying thrilling view of the goblin's ass. The Scorpion demo shows you how to create a room with collisions against the walls. At first you might think, cool, Dark Basic has a collision system, but play it a little longer and you will notice something unusual. When you hit a wall, you don't slide along it like in conventional games. That's because Dark Basic's collision system only reports a fact of the collision, but not how to resolve it, and Scorpion is simply put into his previous location when collision occurs. This limitation would be the nail to the coffin for anything more ambitious than Galaga. However, Dark Basic allows to use DLLs to add functionality. Some games used external DLLs to implement better collision systems, and such systems were created for Dark Basic. These DLLs even allow to add multiplayer because standard Dark Basic Classic doesn't have network capabilities. We are over with examples, but let me introduce you to the pinnacle of Dark Basic creations, Soul Hunter, which I randomly found on IndieDB. Dark Basic Classic is so old and buggy that it doesn't even have its own category on this website. It's listed under the Dark Basic Pro, but on the old forums it's clearly stated as a Dark Basic Classic game. Soul Hunter was in development for over 5 years. 5 years of dark pain. I think everyone watching this video should give this game a try, simply because of the enormous effort that went into it. And it's free. It's incredibly difficult to make Dark Basic work at this level. You've probably already guessed how limited this thing is, and soon enough, we will see the amount of glitches it has. Dark Basic Classic was immediately forgotten after the release of Dark Basic Pro in 2004. Meanwhile, the entire Dark Basic platform began fading away with the rise of Unity, released in 2005. Even back then, people on local Dark Basic forums were already discussing Unity, and some were switching over. In 2015, Dark Basic Pro became open source, and the small community has been trying to keep it alive to this day by adding support for modern hardware. But why was the Classic version forgotten so quickly? There are many reasons, and one of the biggest ones is the frustration between the promise and the actual delivery. I got Dark Basic in 2003 with the manual that explained how to use it. But, for example, how was I supposed to make sounds for my games without the internet to search for the answers or some person to ask? During my Flash development days, I had already learned to use the Windows XP recording tool with my ridiculously cheap microphone. That was my way to record at least some effects, by smashing a book on the table or stealing waveformat sounds from other games and combining them in the recording tool. I figured this out through my own struggles. Dark Basic doesn't teach you that. What about 3D models? Let's take a look at what media Dark Basic provides. This is what you are supposed to use to create a game. This isn't what I imagined my game development career would look like, but that's definitely how it looks like spiritually for the past 20 years. I asked some people and they said they can relate. And that's why we have Dark Matter with models that don't look terrible, just a bit slightly below average maybe. You can't really criticize something that costs only a few bucks and was probably made by a hobbyist 3D creator from the early 2000s, maybe even for free. For the price I think it's decent value, but what really kills it is the level of animation. Just look at this knight. Call me toxic for saying this, but my eyes and my dreams of creating incredible games were betrayed by this pack and ripped apart. I had no access to good models, and I couldn't even afford to upgrade my PC to play modern games. My Radeon 9100 struggled with everything, to say the least. To sum up this topic, the Dark Basic box really should have included 3 books. The third one should have been about game development in general, describing free software and how to piece everything together. It needed to cover broader topics about game creation, to have some life hacks. Dark Basic felt like beginner software that paradoxically expected you to already know what you were doing and how things worked. It's like applying for a junior developer job that somehow required 3 years of commercial experience. The same nonsense. So let's create a game and see how it goes, shall we? I decided to use this Raptor model for today's game. Just look at this attack animation. I opened the Raptor in Blender, made some modifications and redid all the animations from scratch. I made the animations as a single timeline because Dark Basic can play animations from any start frame to any end frame. I won't be using the official editor. Instead, I'll use Dark Edit 1.50, an editor created by the enthusiast that came bundled with the Dark Basic CD, and big thanks to this person. CD version is far from the first release of Dark Basic. Lee Bamba, the creator, initially sold Dark Basic over the internet and shipped physical discs via mail service. For those interested in broader history of Dark Basic Software Limited and its evolution into the game creators, I'll include a link in the description for a video on its history with the Lee Bamba interviews. The language is built around a small set of commands, with each command intended to be powerful and versatile. That's the core idea. For example, Syncrate 60 limits FPS to 60, and Dark Basic completely fails to properly support it. When you set 60, it runs at 30. When you set 90, it runs at 60. To solve this frame rate issue, I manually check the current frame rate. If it drops below 45, I switch the sync rate to 90. If it's higher than 75, I switch it back to 60. And it works surprisingly well. Another quirk is that while Dark Basic supports Windows mode, it always starts in full screen mode at 640 by 480 resolution with 16-bit color depth. You then have to use code to switch resolutions or enable window edit mode. Why this was considered a good idea is beyond me. Matrix in Dark Basic is a retro predecessor of Unreal Engine's terrain system. It allows you to set the height of individual points of the plane by their coordinates, and you can also use a tile map to add texture variations to the ground. This serves as the main tool for level building, since you can query the height at any position of the matrix, so the implementation of collisions with it is easy. Modern terrain systems operate similarly, but they add smoothing polygons in between and rely on shader-based visualization for better quality. I also implemented rotation controlled by mouse movement, which is where new bug appeared, like Pikachu. Dark Basic has functions called mouse move X and mouse move Y that calculate the mouse movement delta between frames. Initially I thought my mouse was dying and skipping movement, but no, it's just Dark Basic. To solve the movement skipping, you have to lock the mouse to static coordinates. On the next frame, calculate the delta by comparing the mouse's position to the static coordinates, and then reset the mouse back to the static position. This delta is your new mouse movement. In other words, Dark Basic offers seemingly useful and powerful commands like mouse move and sync rate, but they often fail to work as intended. Next, I added columns. These columns are a tribute to now lost manuscripts. With black fog and textured columns, I finally settled on the style and atmosphere for the game. As the next step, I decided to plant trees and, you guessed it, ran into more issues. I wanted some quick, decent 3D models, so I found some free tree models online. I hope you weren't expecting me to rely solely on Dark Basic's media. Since I prefer using modern Blender, I switched to my Windows 10 machine. Sorry, but the version of Blender available for Windows XP is nearly unusable, and I have no desire to learn 3ds Max. I reduced the polygon count and re-exported the bushes and tree trunks as separate models. You might ask, what could go wrong? And Dark Basic supports two 3D file formats, X and 3ds. Exporting to X from modern software is nearly impossible. I couldn't find any functional exporters for Blender. However, 3ds exporters still exist, so I used that format instead. Only one model out of the 2 trunks and 2 leaves ended up visible. The files seemed fine. So after about an hour of troubleshooting, I discovered that 3ds for Dark Basic has healthy and unhealthy objects. To turn an object into a healthy one in Blender, you need to duplicate a healthy object, combine the unhealthy one with it, then delete the healthy mesh inside the combined object. The remaining unhealthy mesh will then become healthy, and after re-exporting, it will show up correctly in Dark Basic. I really went through this process multiple times with all my models to make them load properly in Dark Basic and make the trees appear. Looks like that the polygon separation tool in Blender makes a separated object unhealthy. I also tried re-exporting the models using older versions of 3ds Max and Blender inside Windows XP, but it didn't change anything. Transparency for the leaves is a different story. Dark Basic supports two options for transparency: ghosts and masks. Ghost mode simply adds the color of the polygons to the existing rendered graphics rather than replacing it. This transparency effect is easier to calculate on the GPU side and doesn't require polygon sorting. Regular transparency, on the other hand, which uses an alpha channel, requires to be rendered from far to near, and the easiest way to avoid this is to just not implement it, and that's exactly what Dark Basic did. Here I don't judge, because back in the days it was a really slow operation. The second transparency option is masking. Dark Basic will avoid drawing pure black color in textures if turned on. I heavily edited the leaves texture, replacing the alpha channel with black, and clear edges from dark in-betweens, and I think that the result looks pretty. Next, let's talk about collisions. The internal collision system of Dark Basic is more of a downside than an advantage, so I decided to write my own and place it in a separate file, and here comes the new issue. Not a bug, just by design limitation. Dark Basic offers three options to implement functions: usual functions, go sub, and go to. Functions in Dark Basic encapsulate all the variables inside and don't have access to the global space. You also can't send arrays to functions, neither as pointers to the arrays nor as copies. So functions are limited as hell, and for some reason they are presented in the manual as an innovation, while go sub is stated as a compatibility feature for older basic code, whatever this statement means. Functions in Dark Basic are castrated. They are useful only for constants and switch statements and setting up some 3D objects. That's mostly what I found them useful for. For example, I get the parameters of an enemy type by using the certain functions placed in a separate file, or for setting up a player 3D object just to move initialization of 3D elements somewhere else to reduce the main code size at least a bit. Indeed, it sounds like dark coding. A go sub jumps to a label in the code, and with the return statement it returns to the place from which go sub was called. By design, go subs have no parameters, but you can use global variables to get around that limitation. Meanwhile, goTo is simply a jump to a label. So in other words, implementing recursive function calls for tasks like pathfinding is tricky. The language doesn't provide enough functionality for recursion, even so I can imagine how to implement it, and yes, I think I can do binary tree inversion using Dark Basic, but I won't. Functions are the only things imported when you include a separate file in Dark Basic. All labels, variables, arrays, all other code is ignored. This language behavior forces you to write almost everything in a single file. Object IDs, image IDs, matrices and sounds are still shared. They're kind of a super global space, and all of them are addressed by their numbers that you can store in variables and pass to the functions. When your code exceeds 1000 lines, you naturally start navigating through functions and labels menus at the top of the editor, and you begin to think in terms of a single file. It's frustrating but still usable, especially for small games like this one. So, collisions. I've created several arrays to store data about the collision type, whether the collision body exists, radius, position, dimensions, and so on. I chose to implement 2D collisions because there will be no hate in my game in terms of gameplay. It will be logically flat. The collision of two spheres is easy. You simply sum the radiuses and check it against the distance between the spheres. The normalized delta of their positions gives you a collision resolve unit vector. If one of the objects is static, you move the second one by this unit vector multiplied by the penetration distance. If both bodies are dynamic, like the player and an enemy, you move each by half of the penetration distance in opposite directions. For a sphere versus a box, you calculate the delta of the positions of their centers and clamp the result by the dimensions of the box. I mean half width and half height. This way, you take the closest point on the box to the sphere, and then you apply the same math as with sphere-to-sphere collision. Check the distance from the sphere's center to the point on the box versus the radius, and move the sphere by the calculated penetration distance. In the main code, I move the collision collision body by the player's movement, check the collisions, and then move the player to the collision body's position. This implementation allows objects to slide over each other like in a typical shooter. Next, I added AK-47 model. AK introduces animations into this project. I took the AK-47 model from the Dark Matter pack, opened it in Blender and added a shutter and hands to the model. I wanted reloading process to look polished, not just, a gun disappearing under the bottom of the screen and reappearing with the magazine click sound. I animated the shooting sequence, reloading and an intro animation. You can probably guess already that this didn't go smoothly, based on my prior experiences with Dark Basic, and you would be correct. That's how the animation looked like. I loaded the file into 3ds Max and saw the same problem. So the conclusion was that the Blender 3ds plugin was somehow messing up the rotation data in the animations. After an hour of searching for a fix, the solution happened to be fairly simple. I had to export the model from Blender as a legacy Collado file, load it into 3ds Max 2010 on my Windows XP machine. Fix the glitches, like a single frame where a hand might rotate 140 degrees, and then export it further to 3ds. Only in this way it was possible to make the animation to work in Dark Basic. I think this time it's a Blender plugin was to blame, not really Dark Basic. There are some online 3D file converters out there and they all suck. They all either stripped the animation entirely or converted it with problems, so I didn't find a solution to remove 3ds Max from this exporting chain. For the enemy Raptor model I added some extra polygons, even sliced an additional limb to the neck. Then I fully reanimated it. New animation looks nice for something without bones and inverse kinematic. Issues were already known, so this went smoothly. However, the running animation cycle for some reason was broken in Dark Basic, while it looked okay in 3ds Max. The only cure was to fully reanimate the Raptor's running cycle from scratch. Next I implemented bullets, also made Raptors to die from them, made players' death screen, and started to work on the level upgrades. All of these features were handled by processing arrays containing various data types. The Raptor AI is a state machine described by code, not far from what you might implement yourself in Unreal Engine for basic actions. For 2D elements like text and sprites, Dark Basic uses Direct Draw, an ancient technology with terrible support on modern hardware and operating systems. Back to the level, even DirectX 1 demos work on Windows 10 at around 20 FPS, while my Windows XP machine runs them with hundreds of frames per second. I plan a video about digging into DirectX 1, so if you're interested, subscribe, like this video. So yeah, on modern OS's text rendering is the primary culprit behind performance drops. However, power-up icons I placed into the 3D world because 2D sprites are not text and moving them out from Direct Draw is easy. The health bar is a 3D object as well, a simple plane with the texture I drew in Paint. Adding sounds was relatively simple. Dark Basic supports only one sound container, Wave, and fails to support it fully. Initially I used float sampling format because it's default in modern Audacity, but to make it work in Dark Basic I had to convert everything to 16-bit PCM. Dark Basic provided some sounds in media, but their quality was so poor. I decided to source free-to-use samples from freesound.org instead. Pain, scream and death sounds I worked out with my friend, using my Rode NT USB, quite a solid microphone. I voiced painful screams of the player character caused by Raptor stealing his flesh, while friend provided the disc scream. His inspiration came from the Gothic series, a game he's played a lot. He nailed the role. I believe he has a big talent. For music, Dark Basic relies on MIDI files. Music is the only area where Dark Basic's media library shines and delivers really well. The tracks, composed by a musician known as Pix, are incredibly well crafted. I wrote a letter to them cause they requested to be notified if anyone used their music in a game, but sadly received no reply. Just imagine how surreal it would be if they saw it 20 years after Dark Basic's release, their work is still being used in new creations. From other random Dark Basic glitches, mip maps work terribly. They blur everything to hell, but without them pixels start to fight for a place on your screen. You can notice this on AK-47 sites. Mip maps remove this problem, but they make AK4N to look ugly. So I just scaled the UVs for the sides to avoid using MIP maps and resolved this issue. Dark Basic fails to properly clear the background for widescreen resolutions. Even when set to Full HD, it only clears a 4:3 rectangle. That's just a funny one. To fix this, I created a full screen plane, moved it far enough into the fog, and it became some kind of 3D screen cleaner. Dark Basic has no idea if the music track is ended. Once a track starts, it's treated as playing indefinitely unless manually stopped. Dark Basic doesn't track the end of the track by itself. While there is a music playing command to check status, it always returns 1 even while the track has audibly ended. To solve this, I created an array to store the lengths of all tracks and use a timer to determine when a particular track should finish. Dark Basic allows a maximum of 255 characters per line, which becomes especially annoying when passing long lists of parameters to functions. I wish I could say here the problem's ended. I wish I could tell you that at this point everything was solved and I was ready to release the final version of the game. Indeed, I did make a final version and I ran it. And the most frustrating bugs didn't show up during development. They appeared only in the final build. The release version behaved differently from the version ran in development environment. In the final version the text started doubling. Dark Basic simply drew text twice with different styles. In my case, the second layer font size was 36 points, sometimes scaled up to 80 points, randomly. It also depends which text you currently have on the screen. The only workaround I found to address this quickly was to enable text backgrounds. Background simply hides the second text layer behind it, and I didn't find the root cause of this issue. Tuning all of the letters into textures on 3D planes might be the only real solution to the doubling text, something I really don't want to invest my time into. At this point I really started to give up on my ambition to create something nicely done using Dark Basic Classic. Realistically, I think I've gained enough Dark experience with Dark Basic over the course of 3 Dark weeks. And even if I would fix text with 3D planes, it's not the only issue with the final version. Did you expect text doubling to be the last one? After the menu music track starts playing, Dark Basic refuses to switch to any other track. You can stop it, it will, but when you try to switch it, it won't. When you try to play, say, track 5, instead it starts to play the menu track again. So I tried force deleting the first track, loading a different melody into the first index and playing it, but even then the deleted menu track is played again. So I didn't find a bypass for this bug. And when you are playing from the Dark Basic editor, music switch is fine. Editor version overall behaves better. On the flip side, when playing the game on Windows 10 there is no music at all. Dark Basic on Windows 10 is unable to play MIDI, so I guess no music is an intended solution to this. After putting all this effort into making a game, experiencing all of these problems on Windows XP appropriate hardware is frustrating. To me, this story speaks a lot about Dark Basic Classic. I uploaded the result of this development on itch.io to gather feedback. On Blue Sky, one of my followers, Danilo Diaz, tested the game on his retro hardware Radeon 9600 XT, 128 MB of memory, running under Windows XP. Game worked at a decent FPS. However, there was an issue with textures. They looked completely off, even bizarre. It's not like texture size is a problem, judging by how exactly it is broken. Textures were all sized as powers of 2, with a maximum of 1024 on 1024 resolution, so I think the size wasn't the problem. It looks like random pixels are corrupted at random places in the weird manner, but on CRT the game looks incredibly cool. So the final word on this: Dark Basic Classic deserves to be remembered as an important piece of hobbyist game development history. A lot of people 24 years ago boarded this dark train. However, Dark Basic Classic is not something I will recommend for retro development at the end of 2024, unless you know what you are signing up for and are prepared to follow this dark path. Dark Basic Pro, on the other hand, is a completely reworked language and compiler. It generates machine code from your basic programs and is different game development beast. It's open source and still supported and is good option to explore Dark Basic today, while it still supports Windows XP and Windows 98. As for the classic version, someone could try just for the challenge. To try to create a game while your development software actively tries to sabotage your project. I think it may be an intriguing idea idea to create my own version of Dark Basic Classic, one that works normally, but supports the original language, while not being Dark Basic Pro, but raises something in between, capable to make my game to work normally on modern hardware without any changes. Also, it might be an interesting topic for yet another video. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. When I create something, it feels deeply personal, and I genuinely care about the entertainment of my videos and educational value. So it will be really nice if you leave a comment, good or bad, it doesn't matter. Critique will help me to improve. Wish you a nice 2025. Thank you for watching. Good luck and bye.